Hello again, Professor Jared Rathel here. Lesson 5-2 focuses on population ecology. We're going to start with this beautiful fish, a fish with a face only a mother could love. The slime head, as fishermen originally called it, used to be no more than bycatch. When it was inadvertently pulled up in fishing nets, it was considered a trash fish and it was tossed back overboard. But then, in the late 1970s, the slime head was rebranded as the orange roughy. That sounds a little more appealing, huh? So orange roughy becomes all the rage at fine dining seafood restaurants all around the world and soon finds its way into grocers' cases and supermarkets across the West. It's a light, flaky fish, really doesn't have a ton of flavor, to be honest with you, but if you cover it in breadcrumbs and fry it and drizzle it with lemon butter, yeah, anything done like that tastes pretty good. So, like the deep sea anglerfish, the orange roughy inhabits the midnight zone, way down deep in the dark, cold depths of the ocean. The orange roughy is found at depths of some 6,000 feet. So, one of the first big orange roughy fisheries was off the southwestern coast of New Zealand, right here. So in this topographic map, the warm colors represent shallow seas, and the cooler colors represent the deep ocean. As you can see, off the southwestern coast of New Zealand, the continental shelf drops off very, very quickly, and so fishermen don't have very far to go to get into deep water. So these deep sea trawlers will drag these massive weighted nets along the bottom of the ocean and they plow over anything in their path. And as you can see here, these deep sea trawlers become very proficient at catching tons and tons of orange roughy. So this red curve here represents the tens of thousands of tons of orange roughy that are harvested beginning in the late 1970s. And as you can see, year after year, fishermen are catching more and more and more and more orange roughy until the catch peaks at about 90,000 tons of fish around 1990. And then suddenly there is this precipitous drop as less and less and less of these fish are caught. And oftentimes, more energy, more boats, and more time was spent fishing, but less fish were being caught. And we see the same pattern across other orange roughy fisheries all around the world, inclining more and more and more, followed by a precipitous drop off. So, why? What's happening to these fish? Well, turns out that the average age of one of those orange roughy pulled up by those deep sea trawlers is like 100 years old. Some of these fish have been aged at over 200 years old. Further, the orange roughy doesn't even reach sexual maturity. It's not able to reproduce until it's in its 30s. Humans had fished out this ancient fish in fishery stocks around the world. The orange roughy has what population ecologists call a slow life tempo. It takes a very long time to reproduce and it has a very long lifespan. Compare the life tempo of the orange roughy to that of us humans, right? We're lucky to live 75 years compared to the average age of 150. Orange roughy don't reproduce till they're in their 30s. Humans become sexually mature as teenagers, not emotionally mature, but sexually mature at around 15 years of age. So our life tempo is essentially twice as fast as the fish that were on our dinner plates. The science of population ecology teaches us that the orange roughy is not really a good candidate for harvest. The orange roughy's slow life tempo makes it such that it's very easy to over harvest this fish in an unsustainable way. Now let's look at another species, the grasshopper. Adult female grasshoppers begin laying eggs just 1 to 2 weeks into adulthood. They lay these things called pods, which you see before you, and they can lay up to 25 pods. Each pod contains anywhere between 15 and 150 eggs. The eggs are going to develop rapidly and hatch into nymphs, these tiny little grasshoppers. They're going to molt numerous times, but within 5 weeks, those nymphs are going to grow into reproductive adults. So the generation time to go from adult to egg to nymph and back to a new generation of adults is just approximately 6 weeks in the grasshopper compared to some 30 years in an orange roughy. My job as your professor is certainly not to tell you what to or what not to eat, but to present you with accurate information so that you can make informed decisions. Arthropods, like grasshoppers, represent an ecologically sustainable source of protein. So farming grasshoppers requires substantially less space, less water, and less energy than other farmed protein sources like beef or pork or salmon. These are chalupines, and I probably butchered the pronunciation, but they're a mainstay in some Mexican and Central American cultures. So my wife and I, we lived in Thailand in 2009 and 2010. And in Thailand, it's very, very common to see arthropods for sale for consumption in the markets. The reality is if everyone on the planet today, all 7.5 billion people on planet Earth, ate the way that Americans do, a diet rich in red meat and pork and fish, we would need 3.9 Earths in order to provide the resources to feed that many people. As we head towards a population of 9 billion humans on the planet by 2050, that's in your lifetime, our lifestyle is simply not sustainable. But we are a creative and a resourceful species. This is one of the many startups. This one is in Austin, Texas, that is now farming and marketing cricket-based protein. So a former student of mine brought me in some toasted sriracha crickets from Akita, and I have to admit, I like them better than potato chips. A population ecologist is going to explore how biotic, meaning living factors, other living organisms, as well as abiotic factors, the non-living components in the ecosystem like temperature and precipitation regimes, how biotic and abiotic factors are going to influence the distribution, density, and abundance of populations over time and across space. So let's quickly dissect each of those terms: distribution, density, and abundance. The distribution of an organism is how it's spatially arranged. Now, I do not want to be all doom and gloom in this ecology unit. I want to share with you a success story. The mountain lion, also called the cougar, puma, panther, or catamount, is an example of a modern day conservation success. So, the first European Americans wipe mountain lions out east of the Mississippi River, but they have a stronghold in the western United States. And currently, the distribution of the mountain lion is again expanding eastward. So we've got lots of mountain lion populations that have been reestablished in the Midwestern United States. You can see those little black dots there. And increasingly, there are more and more mountain lion sightings east of the Mississippi once again. Dispersion refers to how organisms are spatially arranged at small, local scales. So, species that show clumped dispersion would include schools of fish, or flocks of birds, herds of bison, or packs of wolves. Uniform dispersion is when species are regularly spaced out across the landscape. So these are terns. They're colonial nesting seabirds. They build these little mud nests that are fairly uniformly distributed along the coast, just pecking distance away from each other. So territorial species like the hummingbirds that are guarding the feeders around your house, they typically exhibit uniform dispersion. And then lastly, when we look at the saguaros that are distributed across the white tanks, this is an example of random dispersion. Next, we have density. Density refers to the number of individuals that are found per some unit of area. So if we lay down a transect here, we can observe, measure the number of starfish per square meter. That would be a density. Or we can go out and we can spotlight deer, and we can estimate the number of deer per square kilometer. Abundance refers to the actual number of organisms that are in the population. Don't worry, we're going to come back to these data. These are data from northwestern New Jersey, black bear data from my dissertation. But what I've done here is I've estimated the abundance or the number of black bears living in northwestern New Jersey in forests, which is represented by the green line here. And then the red line represents the abundance of black bears living in urban areas. As you can see, it really spikes in these years, and we'll talk about all the conflict that that created later in this unit. So, estimating the abundance of mobile species can be a tricky business. Black bears, they just don't mail in their census forms. So, population ecologists use what are known as the BIDE equations to estimate abundance, where B stands for births, I stands for immigration, and these two components represent deposits into the abundance of the population. D represents deaths, and represents immigration. That's when individuals permanently leave the population. Those represent the withdrawals from the abundance. So fertility has a precise meaning in population ecology. It represents the average number of offspring produced per female, and it's usually per female of some age class. So these are those New Jersey data again. These data are from about 1,100 den surveys. We estimated fertility rates in wild land bears, bears living in the forest, and that's represented by the green line. You can see wild bears by about 9 years of age. are pumping out about 2.5 cubs per female. And then the red line represents the fertility of the urban bears. You can see that they produce more cubs early, and then they continue to produce high numbers of cubs late into life because they've got this high caloric diet. They're eating lots of human foods. So, fertility is a good measure of a species' life tempo. Female chimpanzees reach sexual maturity between 10 and 13 years of age, and they'll typically produce one offspring about every 5 years. They have a slow life tempo, like most large bodied vertebrates. Female wolf spiders, on the other hand, these guys only live for 1 or 2 years. Their egg sacs, which they carry on their backs, hatch into baby spiderlings. Wolf spiders, like most arthropods, have a very fast life tempo. They're going to live fast, breed early and often, and die young. And sometimes they die from broom wielding humans.
No. Oh, look at the babies come out of it. Oh, look at them. Jesus, look at the babies.
So I love that guy's accent. Look at all the babies. So another way that population ecologists can represent the life tempos of different species is by expressing their survivorship curves. So there are three generalized survivorship curves that are going to represent most species, although there's always generalizations. I will tell you, these survivorship curves do show up on your assessment. Survivorship curve type 1 is this red line right here. And what this is demonstrating is in these species, most of the young survive. Most of the juveniles survive, most of the adults survive, and it isn't until we get to the end of the species lifespan that you see high mortality rates. So type 1 survivorship curves represent large-bodied vertebrates, things like hippos and humans, organisms with a slow life tempo. Type 2 survivorship curves, represented by the blue line, so this is what's exhibited by small-bodied vertebrates, things like lizards and birds. But with type 2, you're going to have some mortality of the young, some mortality of the juvenile, some mortality of the adults. So there's fairly consistent mortality rates across the different age classes. And then finally, the purple line is a type 3 survivorship curve. And here you have very high mortality rates in the young. So that wolf spider is a great example of a type 3 survivorship curve. The vast majority of those hundreds of spiderlings are not going to survive into adulthood. Plants also have type 3 survivorship. So if you think about an oak tree, it's going to make bazillions of acorns. And the vast majority of those acorns are never going to germinate and grow into an adult tree. Okay, so we're going to conclude this lecture by thinking about how population abundance changes over time. Important point. All populations of all organisms initially increase exponentially in a perfect world where resources are abundant and there's little to no competition between individuals. So when African elephants were reintroduced to Kruger National Park in the early 1900s, this population grew exponentially, just like we would predict, with rapid growth here in the early 1960s. But elephants are massive herbivores with huge energy requirements. Eventually, the elephant population, like all populations, begin to experience the negative effects of high densities of individuals. So elephants began competing for limited resources, and we saw increasing mortality rates and decreasing fertility rates. And then the growth of the population slows. The population has hit what's called its carrying capacity, represented by a big K here. So the carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals that the environment can support. On the left, we see an exponential growth curve, the way populations grow in ideal conditions when there's no negative density dependent effects. On the right, we have what's called the logistic population growth model. The population begins by growing exponentially, but as abundance increases and density increases, so does competition for limited resources like food or nesting cavities. Densities increase, mortality goes up, fertility goes down, and the population growth rate slows as the population approaches carrying capacity. So the logistic growth curve, this S-shaped sigmoidal curve, is easily replicated in the lab in microcosms of paramecium on the left, and then the Daphnia water flea on the right. Here you can see in the Daphnia that the population overshoots carrying capacity and then precipitously drops down. And oftentimes we'll get this waggle around carrying capacity. That brings us back to where we started with Homo sapiens. On October 31st, 2011, the global human population reached 7 billion people. By 2050, that's in your lifetime, the global population will exceed 9 billion. Growth rates are slowing, but most demographers don't think we're going to reach carrying capacity until we hit somewhere between 10 and 13 billion people around 2100. The biggest question of our lifetime is, can the planet support that many people? So check out this National Public Radio video. It's posted just below in Canvas. It's short, but it really illustrates just how tremendously the human population has grown since the Industrial Revolution.